The very first Debatetrack video, the March 2020 topic, is given entirely while walking around the streets of Taipei's Guting neighborhood, where I lived for one of the 5 years that I lived on the island. I came back to America for a number of reasons, but also left Taiwan for a couple. Low but ever present on the list was the constant threat of an invasion, and the implications for whatever life I was building there. 3 years post-move, the terror lives on, but in a different way. An invasion of Taiwan may kill, injure, displace, or harm a great many people that I love. You might expect me then to vociferously support a US defense of the island, but my time agonizing about the possibility has led me to conclude that almost nothing, not a defense of our American values, nor a defense of our allies, is worth nuclear Armageddon. And even something that raises the possibility by 1% or 5% should be approached with the gravest caution, or maybe just not done. Better read than dead, they say. Because what exactly is worth rolling a D20 on civilizational incineration? Now, that doesn't put me on either side of this topic, pro or con. Deterring China from invasion is good, and Taiwan's independence capabilities, being able to provide that deterrence, is good. And the US helping Taiwan to achieve those capabilities by continuing to supply arms is good. But there's enough risk in all of those reasonable, justified things that this topic will allow both sides a number of solid arguments. And by a number, I mean like one. This topic is important, but may be tired to experienced debaters as the Taiwan flashpoint ties into many topics and will be quite familiar to you. Taiwan last came up in May 2022, the free trade agreement topic, and this shows how important it is, because we haven't seen a dedicated topic on Croatia or Benin or Wales, yet we've had 2 on Taiwan in 3 years. So for newer debaters, pay close attention these months. This topic will keep coming up in your debate rounds and in the news, and if the bowling ball of history stays in this gutter, it may appear all too concretely in your life. Topics like these always make me reflect on the utility of debate. To what extent is Thucydides' trap both laid and triggered by the Leviathan himself? And to what extent do we, you or I, or anyone, even the most powerful people in the world, get a say in history's progression? Certainly not you or I, it seems. So for the debate community in Taiwan in particular, greetings. I pray that debating this topic spurs constructive change on the island and a serious mental preparation for those that live there. Now, your 2024 Nocember topic, Taiwan defense. Two quick things before we begin. First, all evidence cited can be found at Debatetrack.com. Your subscription fee keeps these lectures free, and buying a brief is the best way to support this channel. Thank you for supporting Debatetrack and for fueling accessible debate. Number 2, all evidence cited here and the quotes that I read are cut the same way as in debate rounds. None of them are read verbatim. And actually, a third thing. I want to acknowledge that I'm not a debater and have never been a debate competitor. I'm a topic lecturer and have been a debate coach in the past, but these are all different things. If, as a debater, you have suggestions for how these lectures or the briefs could better help you, please let me know in the comments or send me an email. I'm always trying to make these lectures and briefs 2% better for you all. For example, I want to phase out the less topical arguments that I always include in the briefs, including counterplan adjacent material, so that every card you get is highly usable. But I am open to feedback on this point. We'll begin this lecture with a beefy background section, then affirmative arguments, and then end with negative arguments. So, to begin, here is your resolution. The United States should substantially reduce its military support of Taiwan. This resolution is fairly self-explanatory. The only real term to discuss is military support, which could mean one of two things. 1, selling arms and military equipment to Taiwan. This is the most reasonable interpretation of the resolution. Or 2, defending Taiwan in case of an invasion. This is not a reasonable interpretation of the resolution, because we can't substantially reduce something that we're not currently doing. But direct military support of Taiwan is relevant to the discussion. In other words, US intervention is relevant. So, AF wants us to pull back from selling arms and military equipment to Taiwan. NIG wants US support to remain the same, to maintain the status quo. It's worth looking at some basic geography that should come in handy as well. Here is China in purple and Taiwan in orange. You'll notice that both have a bunch of ancillary islands and that some of Taiwan's islands are right off the Chinese coast. The sea in between China and Taiwan is called the Taiwan Straits, and relations between the two territories are often dubbed cross-strait relations. Now, Chinese and Taiwanese people speak the same main language, Mandarin. They use the same calendar, celebrate many of the same holidays, look the same. Most citizens of both places are ethnically Han. Depending on the part of China in question, they may eat similar foods and have similar cultures. So why the cross-strait animosity? At the end of World War II, with the defeat of the Japanese and the de facto end of the decades-long Sino-Japanese War, the two main political powers in China were free to stop fighting the Japanese Empire, who were defeated, and instead fight each other. The Chinese Civil War lasted from 1946 to 49 and ended when the Communists, currently known as the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, defeated the national government, otherwise known as the Nationalists or the KMT. The defeated KMT fled to the island of Taiwan, vowing to return to retake the mainland from the Communists. This map has different years, and indeed it was not a simple war to bracket with numbers. 46 to 49 is simply when they stopped fighting together against the Japanese and were really free for an all-out civil war. It's estimated that 10 to 15% of Taiwan's population descends from this KMT exodus. The vast majority of Taiwan's population comes from earlier migrations from China, mainly coastal Chinese provinces nearby Taiwan. As with many colonized places, there remains a small indigenous population throughout the otherwise homogeneous island. The nationalists had ruled China as the Republic of China. When they fled to Taiwan, they continued ruling under that name, and Republic of China, or ROC, remains Taiwan's official name to this day. China, now under communist rule, was renamed the People's Republic of China, or PRC, which also remains in place to this day. The two sides have had rather unfriendly relations ever since, except by now the two sides have flipped. Taiwan no longer wishes to reclaim the Chinese mainland, but China sees Taiwan as a breakaway province that will inevitably fall back under communist control. The fact that the communists have never ruled Taiwan is not really relevant. The government, and especially their leader, Xi Jinping, have wanted to bring the lost province back into the fold for too many decades to turn back now. In the early years after the Chinese Civil War, after World War II, the famously anti-communist USA supported the ROC government in Taiwan. Most Western countries followed suit, seeing the ROC government as the legitimate government of China, because we can't support the communists. Things changed, though, in 1971, when the UN changed the official seat of China from the ROC in Taiwan to the PRC in Beijing. The US followed the UN's lead in 1979, when official diplomatic recognition switched to Beijing. Since then, many countries have gradually shifted recognition towards Beijing, with only 11 countries currently maintaining formal relations with the ROC, and the most recent switches being by Panama, 2017, El Salvador, 2018, and the Solomon Islands in 2019. The reason? Formal diplomatic relations with the PRC require a severance of formal ties with the ROC, and Beijing's influence, wealth, and trade are all impossible for most countries to pass up. The One China policy requires that countries acknowledge that there is only one China and that Taiwan is part of it. Countries that continue to support Taiwan, however, interpret the One China policy in their own ways. The US's official point of view recognizes that China lays claim to Taiwan, but doesn't acknowledge that Taiwan actually belongs to China. Now, it's always strange to personify a country, to say that the US tries to do this or that China wants this thing or that thing. But this is a debate lecture, not a philosophy class, so here's the question: what does Taiwan think, and what does Taiwan want? Taiwan has existed as a self-governed entity, separate from mainland China, for over 70 years. They have built a vibrant democracy, a technological powerhouse, and a distinct cultural identity. While the international community grapples with the One China policy, the people of Taiwan have forged their own path. Taiwan's reality is one of de facto independence. They have their own elected government, military, and foreign policy. Taiwanese voters showed their shift towards a stronger embrace of their independent status in 2016 when they elected the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, the Green Party, a party that leans towards emphasizing Taiwan's separate identity, to the presidency. and again in 2024 when they re-elected an even more pro-independence candidate from the DPP. However, Taiwan has to walk a fine line here. Any formal declaration of independence would likely provoke a strong reaction from China. Any actions, diplomatic visits, or as we saw in mid-October, even speeches, provokes increasingly heavy-handed responses from the PLA, China's army. A formal declaration would certainly trigger the invasion we'll spend so much time discussing today. The Taiwanese populace has also developed a distinct Taiwanese identity. Recent surveys suggest that a shrinking number of Taiwanese citizens identify solely as Chinese, with a majority identifying solely as Taiwanese, some amount really identifying as both Chinese and Taiwanese. The US, for its part, continues to support Taiwan, despite the immense risk and political costs for several reasons. First, and perhaps propagandistically, values. Taiwan is a progressive and strong democracy with strong cultural ties to the US. Compared to mainland China, Taiwan would be easy to recognize as being culturally influenced by the West. In my first memories living in Taiwan, after 3 years of living on the mainland, I remarked at two things in the local park: baseball and handicapped children. Another example, in 2019, Taiwan became the first Asian country to legalize gay marriage. Second, geopolitics. Taiwan is a key link in the first island chain of US allies that constrains China's power projection. The other key elements of the chain include the Philippines, Japan, Korea, and the Alaska and Aleutian Islands. We'll look at some maps of this later. If you're not familiar though, break one out now and take a look. Third, chips. One company in Taiwan, TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, makes 90% of the world's high-end chips and holds 60% of the total semiconductor market. That includes A-series chips for iPhones, M-series chips for MacBooks, Android Snapdragon processors, AMD chips for PlayStations, Xboxes, and PCs, car chips for Tesla, Ford, GM, and Toyota, and all the usual suspects for chip use, including smart TVs, telecom infrastructure, IoT devices, and AI training systems. What they do in their foundries is to make chips that are designed by their companies. So you're a company, you design your own chip, they make the chip for you, and like I'm saying, they make a lot of the chips. For reference, the second largest chip company, Samsung Electronics, has about 1/3 of the market share that TSMC has, and that's if we're using generous numbers. Suffice it to say, the main global source of microchips that powers our entire digital world is a prize that China craves and that the US wants to keep in its pocket. Now, TSMC is starting to expand to other locations, namely the US, in Arizona, and into Japan, but for the time being, the manufacturing all takes place on the island itself in Taiwan. Last, and perhaps cynically, why the US is interested in Taiwan is the economy. The military-industrial complex makes billions per year off of Taiwan. These companies also effectively control the government through legal bribes and the military through revolving door systems. Continuing the weapons flow to Taiwan makes a lot of people a lot of money, and they're not trying to stop the gravy train for no good reason. So that's the US, why the US may want to support Taiwan, in fact, why we do. Next, China. China also wants to reclaim Taiwan for several reasons, somewhat mirroring the reasons we just went over. The biggest difference in the motivations between the US and China is one of strength. China vehemently wants to take control of Taiwan, whereas the US comparably only kind of wants to defend it. The relative importance of Taiwan is strongly in China's favor. So why does China want Taiwan? First, and again, partly propagandistically, history. China officially sees Taiwan as a breakaway province that must return to the Chinese family, and they may have a point. The KMT that fled to the island only 70 years ago are ethnically, culturally, and linguistically Chinese, and Taiwan was ruled by China at some point. Not the Communist Party, but the rulers of China at some point also ruled Taiwan. Reunifying with China would put an end to the Chinese Civil War that never really ended. Second, national pride. Taking Taiwan has long been a goal of the CCP, but its ability to threaten Taiwan has been thwarted by the US nuclear arsenal and by our conventional military means. For example, the 1995 Taiwan Strait crisis was largely de-escalated through 2 US aircraft carriers sailing near Taiwan. Regardless of what it wanted, China had no real choice but to back down from a fight that it was overwhelmingly outgunned on even though these aircraft carriers were coming from an ocean away. China's meteoric military buildup reflects this history. It has a quickly growing nuclear arsenal, has invested heavily in missiles, including the DF-21D carrier killer, to ensure that it's never again outgunned in a fight. Bandao 423 also explains nationalism in this context as, quote, the belief that Taiwan has been wrongly stripped from Chinese control, unquote. Claiming Taiwan would also be an enormous symbol of Chinese prominence, and the first clear geopolitical symbol that China can triumph against the long-time global hegemon, the US. Finally, to drive home the point that China is deadly committed to taking Taiwan, let me read a quote from a Reuters article published October 16, 2024, entitled, China won't renounce use of force over Taiwan. Quote, we are willing to strive for the prospect of peaceful reunification with the utmost sincerity and endeavor, Chen Binhua, spokesperson for China's Taiwan Affairs Office, told a regular press briefing in Beijing. But we will never commit ourselves to renouncing the use of force, he said. No matter how many troops Taiwan has and how many weapons it acquires, and no matter whether external forces intervene or not, if Taiwan dares to take risks, it will lead to its own destruction, he added. Our actions to defend national sovereignty and territorial integrity will not cease for a moment, end quote. So that's the big one. Third, chips. China wants control over this chip production for the same reasons that the US wants it to remain in the control of an ally. Microchips represent enormous power in the modern technological world. Fourth, geostrategy. As much as the US wants to constrain China to the first island chain, China needs to break free of it to grow its power projection within Asia, the Pacific, and beyond. Security also relates here. China no more wants armed US allies on its borders than the US wants Russian missiles in Cuba or Venezuela. Bandao 423 talks about this. Given the tight band of US allies that surround China, capturing Taiwan would give it some long-sought breathing room. Finally, politics. The CCP exerts authoritarian control over China. Like any empire, this requires a homogeneity of thought, culture, and language, one that has been successfully and brutally enforced in Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang. Taiwan is a symbol of a successful Chinese democracy and an obvious challenge to the CCP's way of government. Baruma 23, quote, China's leaders have long been obsessed with Taiwan because its very existence as a thriving liberal democracy refutes the central premise of the Chinese authoritarian regime, end quote. So this is really a key that to manage an empire well, you do need systems in place where everyone thinks in a similar way, at least ideologically, you know, like who's in charge, for example. And Taiwan does sort of threaten that image for the CCP. Another note that I probably make every time this comes up, but these tools of empire that China uses are also tools of empire that you know, every other empire has used ever. They're not new. So they may seem brutal, but that's just because they're you know, in the process of establishing it. As you know, we did all the same things, and much, much worse, because there wasn't an internet around. Not to justify it, but to put it in context. Okay, next, US support. How does the US military support, the crux of our resolution, play into the China-Taiwan equation? The answer is it is a vital linchpin. Without it, China would seize Taiwan, and only with it is Taiwan able to maintain its independence. First, US law. Several US laws are in place that mandate this support. The Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. When the US switched official diplomatic relations to Beijing, it switched on a commitment to Taiwan that would consider any non-peaceful changes to Taiwan's status a grave threat and that would provide defensive arms to Taiwan as needed. The TRA also establishes the basis for strategic ambiguity, the US's ambiguous stance about whether it will come to Taiwan's military aid or not in the event of a war. This strategic ambiguity has long stopped China from launching an invasion, because for a long time, they wouldn't be able to defeat the military that might show up. And also, kept friendly relations with China, because the US never explicitly stated that it would come to Taiwan's aid. Second law, 6 assurances, 1982. These assured Taiwan that the US wouldn't mediate between China and Taiwan, wouldn't pressure Taiwan to negotiate with China, wouldn't alter the Taiwan Relations Act, wouldn't take a position on Taiwan sovereignty. Essentially, the 6 assurances agreed to continue supporting Taiwan despite a growing relationship between the US and China. Third, the Taiwan Assurance Act of 2020. This act sought to reassure Taiwan of the U.S.'s continued support based on the 6 assurances. This assurance was given to Taiwan during growing tensions across the Taiwan Strait. Now, we've just seen the legal basis for support in Taiwan. How does this translate into military support? The U.S. is Taiwan's main military supplier and has sold a number of large and crucial systems to the island. The U.S. sold 150 F-16 fighter jets to Taiwan in 1992. In 2019, it sold an upgraded model, and the older F-16s were also upgraded by the U.S., enhancing their radars, avionics, and weapon systems. The Patriot missile system is crucial for Taiwan's layered air defense systems meant to defend against missiles and aircraft intruding on Taiwan's airspace. It has about 7 Patriot batteries, although the exact number is not public. The Harpoon missile system was approved for sale in 2020, including land-based launchers and missiles for anti-ship capabilities. The delivery of the system has begun and should be complete by 2028. The same year, 2020, saw HIMARS, the highly mobile tactical ballistic missile system, approved for sale to Taiwan. The full list of capabilities sold to Taiwan by the U.S. is lengthy. It includes torpedoes, patrol aircraft, advanced radar systems, Abrams tanks, portable Stinger missiles for low-altitude air defense, and both training and technical assistance, to list only some of the extensive military support the U.S. has offered. Spare parts are also a crucial and common thing that are sold because Taiwan uses, for example, its jets so often to track and shadow Chinese military incursions on its airspace. The jets actually get a lot of use, meaning that they need a lot of spare parts. In fact, this is probably one of the big reasons China does it, is to wear down the ability of the equipment and also the pilots and the rest of the military to keep responding to this. It just wears you down. So that is what the U.S. sells to Taiwan, everything. However, despite this impressive list of approved arms sales and completed arms sales, Taiwan has yet to receive many of these purchases from U.S. arms manufacturers. Gomez and Giltner, 1024, cite a backlog of over $20 billion, raising concerns about the island's readiness in the face of Chinese growing military might. Indeed, even if deliveries stay on schedule, which seems unlikely given historical delays, critical systems like the anti-ship Harpoon missiles won't be delivered until 2026. These delays underscore the lack of urgency on the U.S.'s side in helping to ensure that Taiwan is ready for the invasion that could come any day. There are several notable reasons for this backlog. First, bureaucratic delays. The process of approving and processing arms sales can be lengthy and complex, involving multiple layers of bureaucracy in both the U.S. and Taiwan. 2, production constraints. The U.S. defense industry, while capable, faces limitations in its ability to rapidly increase production of certain weapon systems, particularly those in high demand. It's Kavanaugh 23. One of these reasons is that the U.S. sells so many weapons to so many people. It's not just weapons that we're using or a couple of our allies. We sell weapons to the world. Third, prioritization issues. Cohen and Allen, 923, suggests that Taiwan and Egypt are competing for weapons, with countries like Egypt often receiving priority to their larger and more consistent purchases. Of course, Ukraine, to some degree, and Israel, to a larger degree, are also competing for the arms from the U.S.'s limited production capabilities. Finally, on U.S. support, what broad strategy can the U.S., together with Taiwan and other allies, employ to stop or prevent a Chinese invasion? It's widely thought, or at least hoped, that China's dictator, Xi Jinping, the sole man now capable of launching the invasion, wouldn't enact an invasion plan he didn't think would work. Furthermore, the perceived cost-benefit has to be in China's favor. If he takes Taiwan but loses his grip on power or sets China's economy back 20 years, he may calculate that at any particular time that an invasion is not worth it. Halbrands is a professor of global affairs at Johns Hopkins. He introduces this dual model of deterrence. Quote, "The United States and other countries should be able to inject enough doubt into this calculus that even a more risk-acceptant Xi decides rolling the iron dice is a bad idea. This will require 2 mutually reinforcing types of deterrence. Deterrence by denial convinces an enemy not to attack by persuading him that the effort will fail. Deterrence by punishment convinces an enemy not to attack by persuading him that the effort, even if successful, will incur an exorbitant price. The strongest deterrents blend denial and punishment. They confront an aggressor with sky-high costs and low likelihood of success. The US task in the Western Pacific, then, is to show that Taiwan can survive a Chinese attack and that any such war will leave China far poorer, weaker, and less politically stable than before. That's Brand's 1123. Of the two, Mullane Sisson argues that deterrence by punishment is the wiser approach when it comes to Taiwan, because a goal of denial would require the US to get directly involved to fight off a Chinese invasion. Next, what capability does Taiwan itself have to fend off a Chinese invasion? Let's be clear. Taiwan would be hopelessly outmatched in a fight against China. China's military budget is about $230 billion annually versus Taiwan's $19 billion. China's military, the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, has about 2 million active duty military members versus Taiwan's 165,000. So China is roughly 10 times larger in both budget and manpower. China has 3 aircraft carriers, 90 advanced destroyers and frigates, 70 submarines, 1,500 combat aircraft, and the world's largest missile force. Taiwan has 0 aircraft carriers, 24 destroyers and frigates, 2 old submarines, 400 combat aircraft, none of it as advanced as China's 5th-gen J-20, and a limited arsenal of missiles. Check out the global firepower comparison linked in the comments for a visual of these massive disparities. Given this helpless situation, how exactly does Taiwan plan to prevent a Chinese invasion and to fend it off if it's launched anyway? A Taiwan invasion would be amphibious, meaning that Chinese boats would have to ferry equipment and manpower across the Taiwan Straits. An invasion of this scale couldn't be conducted with transport aircraft alone. The amount of equipment, number of troops, and the quantity of supplies could only be carried on transport ships. Now, Taiwan does have a number of advantages in the amphibious invasion scenario. First and foremost, geography. While living in Taiwan, internal propaganda, or comforting stories told over beer, always maintained that China would never be able to invade Taiwan, and geography was always a key factor. Although these advantages may be overblown, there are significant advantages that Taiwan has built in. Being the defender, Taiwan has fortifications, hardened defenses, bunkers, and a whole host of home field advantages that make it far easier to defend a location than to take it. In addition, the Taiwan Straits are about 130 kilometers or 80 miles at their most narrow point, meaning that China's ships would have at least 80 miles where they'd be exposed to Taiwan's radars, fighter jets, anti-ship missiles, torpedoes, potentially submarines, and other weapons during their journey. The strait itself is narrow and choppy, meaning that an invasion would have to be timed just right to avoid the treacherous seas, and that China's submarines would have few places to hide. Once Chinese vessels reached Taiwan's shores, there would be only a few places they could land, mostly on the north and east of the island. Taiwan is a volcanic mountain island, like the Hawaiian Islands, and vast stretches of the coast are rocky and cliffy, wholly unsuited towards an amphibious landing. This makes it easier for Taiwan to predict and fortify potential landing sites. So, geography is one thing Taiwan has in its favor. Second, asymmetric warfare. As the gap between China and Taiwan's military capabilities have grown, it's become increasingly apparent that Taiwan's high-value legacy systems like jets, ships, and other conventional military equipment would be wiped out in short order in a direct confrontation with the PLA. As a result, a focus on asymmetric warfare has developed since the 2000s and has gained increasing tension, although many experts would argue not nearly enough. Termed the porcupine strategy, in Taiwan's case, asymmetric warfare focuses on cheap, plentiful, concealable, and portable lethal capabilities that could survive initial missile barrages from China. Although expensive ships and jets may be easily targeted by the PLA's superior technology, man-portable rockets, sea mines, drones, exploding beaches, fast attack craft, and other measures could inflict heavy damage on an invasion force while costing little in terms of money and casualties for Taiwan's military. Third advantage, potential US support. The US officially maintains a stance of a strategic ambiguity on whether or not it would send troops to defend Taiwan. Although President Biden has said that he'd send troops to defend Taiwan several times, it's not clear that presidents like Trump or Harris would follow suit. especially given the likely limited buy-in of the American public and the extreme cost and risk associated with confronting China in a head-on-head war. However, Taiwan's defense plan almost counts on US support, with military doctrine aiming to hold off China's forces until backup can arrive, and backup always means US troops. But even if the US didn't step up during an invasion, just the threat of US intervention is enough to make Chinese military planners think twice about an invasion, and this seems to have given Taiwan an advantage in preventing the invasion. I wish the list of advantages were longer and the list of disadvantages were shorter. I truly do, but I'm trying to convey this information as objectively as I can. Taiwan has many disadvantages in a fight against China. The first and most intractable disadvantage that Taiwan has is size. As we've said, China's budget and manpower are both roughly 10 times the size of Taiwan's for their military. Mainland China is about 250 times the land area of Taiwan, with all the accompanying benefits of natural resources, supply chains, and strategic options. China has 60 times more people than Taiwan. In a simple war of attrition, China could afford much greater losses than Taiwan ever could. This population is also important for the military-industrial base, and a nationwide effort to supply a war would overwhelm even Taiwan's strongest efforts. Of course, as we've noted, their militaries are also incomparable. These numbers in this chart are from 2021, and the difference is only more stark now. Third, morale and attitude. There are some things that should make us question whether even Taiwan's strongest efforts would be strong at all. First, pro-China, pro-CCP, and pro-unification sympathies still exist on the island. I wouldn't say they run high, but they exist, mainly amongst older Taiwanese who primarily see themselves as Chinese. It's not the case then that everyone in Taiwan would fiercely fight for their independence. Because cross-strait business relations remain strong, some modern businesses also have a pro-China streak, as China remains a lucrative partner in business and employment. Pro-China sentiments also famously run high in Taiwan's criminal organizations, namely the Bamboo Union, Four Seas Gang, and Heavenly Way, the three main China-connected triads which might be easily co-opted for sabotage and subterfuge operations before and during an invasion. A relevant anecdote that I won't get into, although I am American, the only time I've ever had a gun pointed at me was in Taiwan. For pro-independence or pro-status quo Taiwanese, who remain the vast majority, the scale of mounting a defense against China seems overwhelmingly impossible. Defeatism appears rampant, with many feeling the situation is helplessly beyond their control. Poor training is a symptom and a cause of this issue. Because 1 year of military service is mandatory in Taiwan, up from 4 months in 2023, most Taiwanese will have some contact with the military apparatus. This training is often regarded as overly rigid, focused on formalities rather than combat training or effective teamwork. It's often reported that equipment is in poor operational order or too old to be useful. Many people say it's just a waste of time. With much of the training focused on proverbial swabbing the decks, tasks like cleaning and logistics and rote drills, many citizens leave feeling that the training is not only a waste of time, but that no military with the training system they have just experienced could hold its own in battle. This significantly degrades confidence in Taiwan's military and increases feelings of defeatism. Again, Taiwan's strategy, both formal in terms of military strategy and informal in terms of people's hope for conflict, is relying on outside help from the US and other nations, none of which have promised to help. This strategy is reflected in Taiwan's defense spending. 2.2% of GDP, which, while relatively high, is less than countries like Poland, Greece, and Singapore, all countries with far lesser existential threats than Taiwan faces. The 2.2% reflects a need to be prepared, but not an existential emergency that Taiwan truly faces. Ukraine, for example, in the midst of a violent struggle for its very existence, spends 37% of its GDP on its war efforts. It's unlikely that Taiwan would have the ability to ramp up its efforts or spending after the start of a war. So the right time to double down or triple down on that number is 10 years ago. The second best time is now, and the worst time is as an invasion is underway. Taiwan also has the disadvantage of needing two different militaries, focused on two different needs, peacetime and wartime. These aren't really two militaries, but rather two situations that Taiwan must be equipped for, that require two types of preparations. During peacetime, Taiwan's main task is responding to Chinese incursions on its airspace in and around its waters. Incursions across the informal border between Taiwan and China, the median line, have become increasingly common, and incursions into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, which, to be fair, stretches into China itself, are a daily occurrence. Pictured, for example, are the incursions made on October 14th, mere days before filming this lecture. These peacetime incursions are met with radar tracking, fighter jets, missile deployments, and warships, large, expensive, and symbolic pieces of equipment that demonstrate that Taiwan is ready to fight. However, in an actual war, this expensive and conspicuous equipment would likely be taken out in short order, especially fighter jets and ships. A pre-invasion Chinese missile bombardment may also take out runways, military facilities, radar, and missile systems. This is where Taiwan's second military would come in. The asymmetric capabilities of portable and concealable rockets and missiles, including anti-ship and anti-air missiles, and the civil defense based on guerrilla warfare in Taiwan's cities and mountains. The need for two militaries, as it were, means that Taiwan's limited defense budget must be split even more between the things that would matter in an invasion scenario and expensive symbols that would be little more than a speed bump, yet are crucial for day-to-day operations. Although geography is certainly one of Taiwan's advantages, there are also two major things working against its success during a war: distance and isolation. First, Taiwan is about 80 miles from China. This means that the enormous might of the world's second largest army can be concentrated on a pinpoint area right off their coast. Unlike the US military, which aims to patrol the four corners of the globe and have its hand in every conflict, Chinese missiles, ships, and aircraft only have a small perimeter around the Chinese coast to worry about and a limited conflict area to prepare for. Even in the event that Taiwan soundly defeated China and beat them back to their shores, a scant possibility to be sure, China would still be 80 miles away, with an anger and a dedication to rebuild and try their hand again in the future. China is not leaving from Taiwan's side. Second, isolation. Unlike Ukraine, with a vast land area, the ability to mount defense in depth, and strategic room behind the flank to retreat, regroup, and rearm, Taiwan is a small island. China might easily be able to blockade that island and to prevent efforts to resupply Taiwan with war-fighting supplies like oil and arms, or societally important supplies like food and medicine. Once a war breaks out, Taiwan will likely be limited to the stock of supplies it has on hand. Still, there are things Taiwan can do to prepare. This I don't have a card for. There are things Taiwan can do to prepare. Whether we affirm and the US pulls back on military support, forcing Taiwan to fend for itself, or whether we negate and continue to help Taiwan to improve its defenses, there is a future path where Taiwan quickly and comprehensively reprioritizes its defense strategy to effectively deter China. The high-level goal of quick reforms would be to lean into the advantages and dispense with the disadvantages that the island would have in a fight, something it doesn't currently seem to be doing. For example, Taiwan might sufficiently raise its defense budget, accelerate production of asymmetric armaments, and halt purchases of large and costly systems. In terms of civil defense, Taiwan might also prepare its civilian population for a conflict through training, stockpiling supplies, and developing resilient infrastructure. Training the populace on guerrilla warfare and combat could decrease the manpower advantage that China has. Ultimately, this could also make all civilians legitimate targets in an invasion scenario, which probably is why they don't do it. You want to plan for, even if you are defeated, at least minimize the damage to your civilian populace. Despite these ongoing areas of improvement, the ever-present question remains: will any push by Taiwan, the US, and other allies be too little, too late, especially given that the gap between Taiwan and China, massive as it is still growing? Okay, by this point, China's immense advantages in terms of size, economy, population, and national will should all be apparent. The next questions are, what preparations has China been doing to seize this prize? The answer? Nearly everything. China's preparations have been extensive, comprehensive, focused, and lightning fast. Although Taiwanese and some US sources are happy to provide a list of disadvantages that China would face in an assault, I find most of the reasoning to be disingenuous and overly rosy. Peter Zeihan is a notable example, who maintains that given China's demographic collapse and reliant on imports of energy and food, China's society and government would never survive the post-invasion sanctions. John Mearsheimer is another who says that the amphibious nature of the assault would render it impossible. And again, I wish they were right, and I hope that they are. However, taken together, the evidence suggests that China is immensely well prepared and will in short time have the capability to launch a successful invasion if that moment hasn't come and gone already. Under the leadership of Xi Jinping, China has undergone society-wide preparation for war. We'll talk about 3 levels in turn: military, civil, and economic preparations. First, military. For amphibious assault, what will be expected in the invasion, China has built the largest navy in the world. Although its force of aircraft carriers and blue water capabilities are lacking compared to the US Navy, this is not really, as some like to say, a disadvantage. China's navy is laser focused on one goal: taking Taiwan, not on the US's much grander goal of global hegemony. Despite this, China has 2 operational aircraft carriers, another undergoing sea trials, and more on the way. Second, missile systems. The PLA's rocket force also has a large and varied arsenal, I believe the largest in the world, with hundreds of ballistic missiles parked at the bases opposite Taiwan. As previously mentioned, it also fields anti-ship missiles that seem specially designed to keep US aircraft carriers out of the region. Third, fighter jets. China has about 2,500 combat aircraft, including advanced 5th-gen J-20 fighter jets, which it produces at a rate of 240 per year. This is an approximate number, a guess. We don't really know. Nuclear. China's strategic nuclear forces have modernized and expanded significantly in recent years. It currently has a stockpile of around 400 warheads, but that may rise to 1,000 by 2030. Its missile delivery systems are also robust and diverse, with an expansion of hardened silos ensuring survivability of a first nuclear strike. Fifth, morale. China's internal propaganda, including many directives by Xi Jinping himself, have likely bolstered the pride of Chinese soldiers, along with their willingness to fight and make sacrifices for the nation. Studeman 424, quote, "China has made unification with Taiwan the signature issue of his tenure. He now calls it the essence of national rejuvenation. For years, his domestic speeches have been grooming officials, the military, and the public for a great struggle and a major test that will require extraordinary sacrifice." End quote. Last, China's military has and is undergoing massive growth in all other areas, including satellites, cyber warfare, joint exercises with other countries. Nearly any domain you name, China either is already cutting edge, well prepared, or well on their way. Not all areas, but almost all. The civilian realm is where China has truly and quietly differentiated itself from the US and Taiwanese adversaries. First, through military-civil integration. China has pursued a strategy of civil-military fusion, notably in ensuring that all civilian cargo ships and ferries have minimum military requirements. This means that China will have a massive civil fleet at its disposal for troop transport in event of a conflict. The foundation of a whole society's struggle that this war may require has been laid. Do you think, for contrast, that the whole of the American populace is ready to make sacrifices for Taiwan? Second, mobilization readiness. China has prepared its production and transport networks for war. Factories can rapidly transition into military use, and transportation networks can rapidly shift to military logistics. An invasion would clearly not take the invader off guard, and China has readied its whole society for the grand unification of the Chinese people. Third, strategic stockpiling. China has been engaged in stockpiling critical resources, including fuel, food, and essential minerals, to weather the potential economic impacts of conflict and sanctions from other countries. And economic. After seeing how US bloc countries respond to actions they disapprove of, namely with economic sanctions, China has set itself up to weather a storm of US-led isolation and economic punishments against China after the invasion. First, China is actively working to reduce its dependency on Western markets, particularly the US, in anticipation of economic sanctions or trade embargoes that could follow a conflict over Taiwan. Key strategies including its Belt and Road Initiative, strengthening ties with the Global South, including African, Middle Eastern, and Southeast Asian countries, and expanding trade with Russia. Second, domestically, China has leaned into a dual circulation strategy, promoting more domestic production versus imports and more domestic consumption versus relying on outside purchases. Third, de-dollarization efforts are also making the Chinese economy and government less reliant on US dollars, reducing the power that the US has to punish the PRC. Bilateral agreements in RMB, China's currency, have been negotiated with Russia, Brazil, and Iran. Meanwhile, the digital yuan aims to break the US dollar's hold on global trade. China, already the world's largest gold producer, has also been stockpiling gold and divesting itself from US government bonds. The best card on preparations is the Studeman 424 card. Mike Studeman is a former commander of the Office of Naval Intelligence, former admiral, foremost expert on China, and his analysis is truly sobering. China is ready. So as we see, China is fully prepared for what's to come. At least that's what it appears like. Maybe this is all just great propaganda. I don't know. What strategies then can the PRC employ to pressure and finally take Taiwan? First, economic coercion. China is the world's second largest economy, the world's largest manufacturer, and with 1.4 billion consumers, the largest market for companies like Tesla and industries like luxury goods. Not coincidentally, China is also a large trading partner with Taiwan, although Taiwan is pivoting to the US, and the two countries are essentially tied for Taiwan's exports between the US and China. China has directly targeted Taiwan with agricultural import restrictions, a move meant to influence the rural politics of Taiwanese farming communities, and tourism restrictions. In 2021, China banned Taiwanese pineapple, and patriotic Taiwanese across the island responded by buying and eating the island's pineapple harvest. China has straight up stopped trade with countries as punishment for friendly relations with Taiwan. For example, it cut off all trade from Lithuania in 2021, including products with Lithuanian parts, as punishment for opening a Taiwan representative office. China has also blocked Taiwan's participation in larger international organizations like the World Health Organization, and has used its influence to prevent Taiwan from joining economic groups or forming bilateral trade agreements that might help it. However, this economic coercion could be ramped up to 100 as a method to force Taiwan's capitulation. Cutting off bilateral trade might bring Taiwan's economy down by double-digit percentages overnight, while leveling the kind of trade restrictions that the US has put on Russia would not be an option for China. Their economic and political might could be leveraged to further turn up the heat on the Taiwan pressure cooker. Strategy 2, gray zone tactics. These are provocative actions that fall short of explicit war. These tactics are less likely to provoke a response from the US or the international community, and it's likely that China would begin any aggression with these low-level, deniable levels of warfare, according to O'Hanlon 424. Examples include air and sea incursions. Military exercises surrounding Taiwan have become increasingly commonplace, so much so that recent drills after Taiwan's National Day, which employed a record 125 warplanes, was largely brushed aside and regarded as a much smaller drill than we've come to expect. The most serious of these exercises occurred in 2022, after the visit of Nancy Pelosi to the island, an exercise in political showmanship on her part that resulted in nearly a week of military drills, including live fire exercises, anti-submarine attacks, and sea raid rehearsals, all explicitly targeted to display its anger at the diplomatic visit. Studeman 424, quote, China has been deploying more military forces nearer to Taiwan to reduce Taiwan's warning time, practice in anticipated wartime areas, demonstrate supposed Chinese military superiority, and slowly exhaust and demoralize the Taiwan military. These acts are akin to warm start efforts at softening the battle space for follow-on action. Employing a boiling frog tactic, China aims to condition Taiwan to an ever-increasing number of forces surrounding the island, end quote. Next, cyber attacks. Taiwan has the highest rate of cyber attacks in the world. It faces millions a day from China. Turned-up cyber attacks might target Taiwan's infrastructure, including water, transport, and electricity infrastructure, including by exploiting programmatic time bombs that China may have already planted in Taiwanese infrastructure. Next, sand dredging. Sea sand is vital to concrete production, and Chinese vessels have engaged in dredging the sea to collect sand near Taiwan's islands close to China. This tactic shows China's apparent ability to pressure Taiwan's territorial control without resorting to direct military action. There are other gray zone tactics as well, but those are the big examples. Strategy 3. Also no card. No card? No card. What are we doing here? Strategy 3 is a blockade. And now we get into as yet unseen territory. Military drills like those with live fire exercises after the Pelosi visit, or the more limited exercises after this year's National Day, did effectively halt air and sea travel in certain zones, disrupting civilian flights and interrupting normal shipping flow. However, a full blockade or quarantine of the island, now proven in practice, hasn't been implemented in full. Justifications for such a blockade could include security, disease, or defense of China's territorial integrity. This would cut off Taiwan from food, fuel, customer goods, military equipment, or everything, depending on how China's leadership implemented the blockade. A blockade would have the advantage of not escalating directly to violence, but instead putting Taiwan into a slow stranglehold so that it would eventually be forced to capitulate. Any country, namely the US, that sought to break such a blockade would be put in the position of having to fire first on the Chinese forces. The scenario we're most concerned about, and that US military support most directly targets, is an invasion of Taiwan. They might start with outlying islands, namely Kinmen, Matsu, both of which can be seen from China with the naked eye, or Wuqiu, which houses a population of less than 700 people. Pictured is a tiny and decorated islet of Kinmen. The main island is much bigger, but also right off the Chinese coast. A takeover of these islands would be quick and simple, and yet put Taiwan in the position of having to either launch a counter-invasion from positions far away to regain these islands with little strategic value that could easily be retaken by China, or else to allow the clear demonstration that Taiwan is unable to defend its territory. A response from the US would also be difficult. Is it willing to go to war with China, even economic war, over these small Taiwanese islands? Next, here's the big one, a fait accompli, a short, sharp war. In China's ideal world, an invasion of Taiwan would be a short, quick, and decisive fait accompli, accomplished so quickly and with such surprise that countries like the US do not have time to respond. It is widely believed that any invasion would be telegraphed weeks or months in advance, as satellite imagery and spy data would reveal a buildup of troops and military equipment near the coast. I'm skeptical that China couldn't successfully obscure these operations, especially given that huge military staging areas already exist opposite Taiwan, and given that many of the pre-invasion steps of large-scale military drills, insulating the economy and stockpiling supplies, have already been done, and the world is hardly in a state of panic over it. These gradual preparations will continue, and may eventually be difficult to distinguish these normal invasion preparations from short-term, day-before invasion staging. China's rapid military buildup, their choice of technologies, and their long-term ability for meticulous planning, combined with Taiwan's advantages, gives the PLA many options for subduing Taiwan. Let me lay out one scenario for you. This may be a good place to close your eyes and meditate on the brutal efficiency of modern warfare, concentrated in a small region and executed with intent and exquisite timing. The assault would begin at midnight, with a surprise barrage of missile strikes targeting critical infrastructure across Taiwan, particularly focusing on radar stations, air defense systems, and military bases. Undersea internet cables would be cut at the same time. The initial wave of missiles will be designed to blind Taiwan's ability to detect incoming threats, creating confusion and uncertainty from the very first moments. Simultaneously, sabotage operations would be carried out by China-affiliated gangs and sleeper agents embedded within Taiwan. These individuals would attack key power plants, communication hubs, and transportation networks, further crippling the island's ability to mount a coordinated defense. Cyber attacks, launched from within China, would target Taiwan's satellite and military hubs, rendering its ability to communicate with its military units severely compromised. Power grids would fail, and Taiwan would be thrown into darkness, unable to access critical information and intelligence. At the same time, China would unleash large-scale cyber attacks against Taiwan's financial system and media outlets, spreading disinformation and creating mass confusion. These false narratives, amplified through compromised social media platforms, would attempt to undermine the Taiwanese government's authority, sowing chaos and fear amongst the civilian population. Chinese operatives in the media space would claim that Taiwan's government had collapsed, or that surrender was imminent, pushing many citizens to doubt the island's ability to resist. As the cyber and sabotage operations unfold, a covert Chinese naval force, hidden in large cargo ships, would sail into Taiwan's key ports. Under the guise of normal trade vessels, these ships would contain thousands of elite troops who would launch operations to secure these ports. Fast attack boats would simultaneously seize key beachheads at strategic locations. These surprise assaults would cripple Taiwanese coastal defenses before they had a chance to mobilize. At the same time, large swarms of drones, many of them AI-powered and pre-programmed, would fill the skies, taking out Taiwanese fighter jets and anti-aircraft systems in coordinated waves. Air superiority would be established within minutes, and advanced Chinese jets would have free rein to hunt down any remaining defense systems. Any naval ships that Taiwan was able to deploy would be mercilessly hunted down by China's 60 submarines, swarming the waters around Taiwan. While the coastal defenses crumble, China would deploy its massive navy, including its thousands of civilian transport ships filled with soldiers and other heavy equipments. They would establish several more beachheads, rapidly overwhelming the scattered and underarmed Taiwanese forces. The unmanned vessels would carry supplies and reinforcements, ensuring a constant flow of resources to the landing troops. With Taiwan's coastal defenses crippled and China's fleet filled with small, attritable boats, any latent defenses, including portable missile systems, would be hardly a speed bump in China's plan. As the drones continued to dominate Taiwan's skies, another wave of the invasion would begin. Tens of thousands of Chinese paratroopers dropped directly onto Taiwan's capital, Taipei. This airborne assault would be meticulously timed with Taiwan's air defense network already paralyzed by Chinese cyber attacks on its satellites and missile strikes on radar stations. The paratroopers, fully equipped with advanced gear, would land at critical points around the capital, quickly neutralizing any remaining resistance and securing government buildings. At this stage, the island would be cut off from the world. International communications would be jammed, leaving Taiwan unable to send distress signals or request assistance from allies like the US or Japan. With Chinese forces swiftly consolidating control over key ports, military bases, and government centers, Taiwan would be in a state of paralysis. Civilians, disoriented by the combination of cyber warfare and disinformation, would face a reality where resistance seems futile. Within a matter of days, if not hours, China would declare victory. The island would be subdued, its government toppled, and the world left grappling with the consequences of one of the swiftest and most advanced military invasions in history. Taiwan's fall would send shockwaves through the geopolitical landscape, with neighboring countries and global powers forced to reevaluate their positions in the face of a newly emboldened China. Taiwan's civil defense might then kick into gear. Guerrilla troops scattered amongst the mountains that would aim to resist the Chinese occupation. But the more resist, the more Taiwanese would suffer. China's 2.2 million active duty soldiers could be fully employed to burn down forests, bomb the mountains into submission, and hunt down any resistance elements that remained. Finally, if Xinjiang is any model, and it certainly is, a resistant Taiwanese population of 23 million would be brutally re-educated, with Taiwan turned into a gulag island of immense cruelty and hellish brutality. Now this, of course, is only one of the way things could go. You could easily make another narrative for Taiwan or the US or anti-China, but to my untrained, inexperienced, and frankly anxious eyes, this seems the most likely. I should add, this narrative assumes a short, sharp war where the US never has a chance to get involved. If the US were to get involved, World War III might entail the same drawn-out slog the first two world wars involved, with the constant hum of strategic nukes in everyone's ears. For a narrative on this, check out the Kurg article linked in the description, entitled "There Will Be No Short, Sharp War." Other out-of-the-blue strategies, like phoning the US president and guaranteeing nuclear annihilation of Seoul and Tokyo if the US intervenes, might seem uncharacteristic and impossible. But as we all know, we are each day on the cutting edge of history. If you liked that narrative, you will love the 17.5-minute trailer for Zero Day, an upcoming Taiwanese TV series dramatizing the invasion, and linked in the description. Finally here, the timeline. When does China plan to carry out the final reunification of the homeland? The best guess from Western sources is around 2027, when Admiral Phil Davidson said before the Senate Armed Services Committee that the threat from China may manifest. This date is corroborated by sources like the CIA, who say that Xi Jinping has told the PLA to be ready for war by this date. Although some throw this year around confidently as invasion year, T-Day, there is some doubt as to whether Xi Jinping has actually verbalized this date. It's by no means public information. And an understanding that this date X is the year China's military should be ready by, it's not the year that anything will actually happen per se. An invasion will likely take place only if and when Xi Jinping feels he can be successful. That depends on military readiness, yes, but also on contexts like global events, economic readiness, and America's president and political situation. Once the military is ready, China can bide its time in waiting until the moment is right, when military success can be most assured. And as the gap between China and Taiwan and China and the US rapidly grows, the ability to defend Taiwan decreases dramatically. This is Brand's 1123 quote. China has embarked on the largest, fastest, most comprehensive military buildup since World War II. As a result, the balance is changing fast. By the late 2020s, several recent assessments indicate Washington might find it extremely hard to save Taiwan from a determined assault, end quote. Okay, we've talked about the US, China, and Taiwan, but how about the rest of the international community? While most countries would prefer to stay clear, out of harm's way, those more fully allied with either side, or those nearby Taiwan that could be caught in the crossfire, so to speak, may inevitably be drawn into the fight. First, the US bloc. The US's main strength is its network of alliances. However, there are two open questions here. First, its ability to call on military help in a fight to defend Taiwan, which is not an obvious existential threat to anyone but the Taiwanese government. And second, the ability of US allies to actually help. The will may be there, perhaps, maybe not, but is there a way? Japan is the most crucial US and Taiwanese ally whose assistance would be needed. Japan has a large and modern military, with many of its systems highly interoperable with the US. Joint military exercises are common, joint command structures pre-established to allow them to fight efficiently in case of war. The US also operates 15 major military bases in Japan, along with many minor bases, and maintains 55,000 troops in Japan. To clarify, this joint command structure, what I mean is that the US and Japan militaries can easily coordinate together in a war so they can fight as one military and not as two. And that is a pretty cool force multiplier. For more on Japan, you might check out the Debatetrack lecture entitled, Should Japan Build an Offensive Military? At a minimum, the US would require the use of the bases in Japan for defense of Taiwan, to stage troops and handle military logistics and supplies. These bases, therefore, may also be part of China's initial missile barrage, neutralizing the threat in the early stages of the war. Japan's self-defense forces, its military, might join the war for several reasons. Its shared defense commitments to the US as a response to a Chinese attack, or if it determines that defense of Taiwan is in fact in its own national interest. These draw-ins, or some combination thereof, may provide Taiwan with the backing of another of the world's great militaries, ranked as number 7 in the 2024 Global Firepower Rankings. Of course, Japan might be reluctant to join for obvious reasons, not least of which the fact that even in the case of victory, its Chinese neighbor already with a deep and legitimate historical hatred of Japan would still be right off Japan's coast. Korea is in a similar position to Japan. 9 major US military bases, excellent staging grounds for defense of Taiwan, powerful military, number 6 in the Global Firepower Rankings, and with a long-standing mutual defense treaty with the US. It might join a war over Taiwan or not join for similar reasons. And Korea, even more than Japan, might be reluctant to join a war against its massive neighbor to the north. Because again, Japan is at least an island, Taiwan, or South Korea is not an island, peninsula, but it's right next to China and right next to North Korea. AUKUS is a military pact between Australia, the US, and the UK, primarily focused on increasing defense and security in the Pacific region, and particularly in response to China's growing military might. It therefore could act as a vehicle for the UK and Australia to support a Taiwan defense, either directly with troops and military, or indirectly through supply, intelligence, and control of key shipping lanes in the Indo-Pacific, including to disrupt Chinese logistics. One of AUKUS's main goals is for Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. If an invasion took place after it got delivery, which may start in the early 2030s, these submarines may become part of the fight. One side note I've always found fascinating: while Australia's population is about the same as Taiwan's, its land area is more than 200 times larger. The Philippines is a former US colony and at the moment a strong ally, especially given China's incessant bullying of its neighbors. The country is close to Taiwan and would be another excellent logistics and staging ground for Taiwan's defense. A defense cooperation agreement between the US and Philippines gives the US access to several Philippine bases that might play a crucial role in the conflict, especially in intelligence and logistics. Finally, in the US bloc, Europe. The US has many close allies in Europe. Although most of the continent also has strong financial and political ties to China, with European countries would be loath to give up, Europe as a whole would likely side with the US in a Chinese war scenario. However, given their distance and lack of large navies, and especially of naval bases in the Pacific, it's unlikely that Europe would have much practical effect on this fight. However, support of a sanctions regime against China, much as there has been against Russia, would certainly be on the table. Last, even if certain assets like submarines could be put to good use in a Taiwan defense, drawing military assets away from Europe could give Russia an opportunity to hit a weakened Europe, while the US might was focused in the Pacific. Paul Van Hooft is a research leader at RAND Europe. Dr. Tim Swagis is the director of research at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. They say, quote, "During a Western Pacific contingency, we expect a simultaneous heightened threat from Russia to take advantage of the situation, as a result of which these limited French and British assets would be in high demand. Splitting capabilities between opposite sides of the planet would leave Europe even more undefended. Equally, NATO Europe's fifth-generation air assets would be needed in any European scenario," end quote. Okay, I lied. Last in the US bloc is the US. As you see, a continuation or end of US military support is not the same thing as assistance in an invasion. The US can continue to send missiles and radars to Taiwan, yet when invasion day comes, the US can refuse to send its own troops to intervene. But then again, it might. Whether the US steps up to fight or not is important in the responses of the rest of the international community, because no country, Japan, Korea, Philippines, or any other, will unilaterally get in the way of the red tide of the PLA. Whether we intervene or not will depend on many factors, but amongst the most important is the current president. Although having a single person in charge of the entire country is an outdated system that needs to end, it is the system we have. Biden has said several times that he would send troops in a Taiwan contingency. I think maybe at least 3 times Biden has said, like, yeah, they're our friend, we'll defend them. Trump has said, let me quote, "Taiwan is like 2 feet from China. We're 8,000 miles away. If they invade, there isn't a fucking thing we can do about it," end quote. He's also suggested that Taiwan pay more for their defense and accused Taiwan of stealing the US chip business. From the read I get, he would not send troops to Taiwan's aid. Harris has such a short-lived political track record, such a small list of policies, and such an apparent aversion to interviews that it's really anyone's guess what she'd do. I also blame that on the media because no one's talking about this. People are talking about other kind of nonsense. Again, without much other information, I imagine her advisors would play an outside role in the decision. But one thing is for sure, the president would matter, and that could matter for a debate. If China did launch an invasion around the year 2027, that will be towards the end of our next president's term, and therefore, the differential impacts of continued US arms sales hinge on November 5th. If you're debating this topic after the 5th, plan your cases around being able to capitalize on the election results, whichever way they turn. This picture, by the way, is of Green Berets deployed on Taiwan. Note the tactful blurring to keep this whole thing under wraps, so no one knows where he's from. Now the other side, the China bloc. China does not have the strong military alliance network of the US, the longtime global hegemon. However, it does have 2 key allies worth mentioning. First, Russia. To what extent Russia would become involved in a Taiwan invasion remains an open question. Would it have supplies to sell to China after being drained in Ukraine? That perhaps depends on what happens between now and an invasion. Would it commit troops and directly become involved in the invasion? That seems unlikely, given the half-hearted support of China and Ukraine, and the extreme risk and cost associated with every war. But again, you never know with these things. North Korea is a special case. a nuclear-armed military state situated directly on the Chinese border, and the only nation that China maintains a defense agreement and formal alliance with. As tensions continue to grow between China and Taiwan, so do tensions continue to grow between North and South Korea. North Korea is less hell-bent on reunification than China, but that may only be the result of a lack of opportunity. Relations have degraded between the two Koreas to the point where South Korea has been designated enemy number one. And just this week, North Korea began the process of blowing up transit roads on the north side of the demilitarized zone, a further symbol of severing ties with the South. Something a Taiwan conflict would inevitably draw in the Koreas. Marcus Kalukas is the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative. Matthew Kroning is the government professor at Georgetown University. Karlauskas and Kroning, 824. Quote, "There's a real and growing risk of conflict between the US and China over Taiwan. Contrary to conventional assumptions, however, it is unlikely that such a conflict would be contained to the Taiwan Strait. Rather, a US-China conflict over Taiwan would almost certainly become a region-wide war, engulfing the Korean peninsula and pulling in both North Korea and South Korea. This is because China would have a strong incentive to strike US bases in South Korea and to urge North Korea to provoke and tie down US forces there. Similarly, North Korea could choose to join the fight to preempt a feared US attack, taking advantage of a distracted United States to settle old scores with its rival in Seoul, or influence the outcome of a war that would have profound implications for its own security. Further, a lack of preparedness for this two-front war scenario gives Beijing and Pyongyang an additional incentive to attack precisely to exploit the US and allied vulnerability. Unfortunately, the United States and its allies are largely unprepared for such scenarios." End quote. Okay, we're done. What is always shocking about background sections this long, we're running like an hour, is just how much material I didn't include. How many points of view and scenarios and gray zone tactics and their effects, political aspects of the countries in questions, different parties, different leaders, different histories, all of which could be relevant to the debate, I just can't get to. But this was a good start anyway, an hour of introduction. Thankfully, or not, there aren't really that many arguments for either side. So if that section was unusually long, this section will be unusually short. We affirm. Continued US military support of Taiwan strains the relationship between China and the US, thus decreasing cooperation on the pressing issues of our time: climate change, nuclear proliferation, and AI, along with the countless areas the two countries might work together to improve life on Earth. Continued support has also led us to a precarious place, constantly teetering on the edge of miscalculation, war, and thus nuclear escalation. This extreme existential risk is being fought over a small island far away, an island that China has a far more legitimate claim to and strong desire of than America. Substantially reducing military support of Taiwan will reduce catastrophic risk to the US and the world, improve US-China relations, and compel Taiwan to take its own defense more seriously. The main, and if I was debating only contention, is US-China relations. Ongoing military support leads to strained relations in the world's two most powerful countries at a vital moment for the survival of humankind and its flourishing, or its disintegration, and that of civilization itself. First, tensions. Military aid to Taiwan increases Sino-American tensions. Arms sales make China's goal of reunification, vital to their national pride, harder to achieve. It's on par with China preventing the US from holding elections, or preventing us from having guns. It's an action that hits deep into the nation's soul. Because China will not back down, injecting weapons into the equation will only inflame tensions and harm the US-China relationship. On this point, we should trust their own words. This is a Dushwell article, 2024, quote, "I'd like to emphasize that the US and Taiwan strengthening military ties will not bring about security for Taiwan," Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said. He said the assurance will only increase tensions and the risk of conflict across the Taiwan Strait. A Chinese spokesperson for the mainland's Taiwan Affairs Office, Zhu Fenglian, said that the aid violates US commitments to China and sends a wrong signal to the Taiwan independent separatist forces, end quote. And US rhetoric and opinions are not relevant here. Claims that China should dispense with their national pride or respect Taiwan, or that arms sales are purely defensive and shouldn't worry China, are all foolish and childish notions that completely fail to grasp the situation at hand. You might as well lecture a lion on the benefits of vegetarian eating. Ivan Kanapathy is a career military officer who served on the White House's National Security Council under Trump. Quote, attempts to reassure China regarding U.S. intentions are misguided and fruitless. From Beijing's point of view, U.S. weapons and training cannot but support Taiwan's continued separation. In the minds of PRC leaders, the U.S. remains the duplicitous black hand stirring anti-China dissent and the strong enemy the PLA must prepare to defeat. By its nature, the PRC government cannot meaningfully separate U.S. support for Taiwan's democracy from perceived U.S. support for Taiwan's independence. End quote. Yet, the U.S. charges ahead, blindly ignoring these warnings. A commitment to the status quo will lead to disaster, as it has in the past. Ted Galen Carpenter was a senior fellow for defense and foreign policy studies at the Cato Institute. He suggests that the U.S. needs to commit a 180, quietly and tactfully, but a 180 nonetheless, and significantly reduce military support of Taiwan. Quote, Beijing's complaint about Washington's actions have steadily intensified, and they have now reached openly confrontational levels. The Biden administration needs to take the PRC's warnings more seriously. In many ways, Washington's determination to press ahead with greater support for Taiwan as part of an overall containment strategy directed against China is reminiscent of the blunders U.S. officials made with respect to NATO expansion, especially the campaign to incorporate Ukraine and Washington's tone-deaf response to Moscow's escalating complaints. Biden administration policymakers dismissed the Kremlin's repeated warnings that trying to make Ukraine a NATO military asset would cross a red line with respect to Russia's security interests. They discovered belatedly that Russian President Vladimir Putin was not about to cower and accept U.S. diktats simply because the United States insisted that Ukraine had a right to join NATO. The outcome of Washington's approach has been horrifyingly bloody and tragic for the people of Ukraine. Washington risks making a complete blunder in its dealings with China. The administration must implement a quiet retreat regarding its growing political and military ties to Taipei. U.S. arrogance and inflexibility helped lead to the current tragedy in Ukraine. A similar approach seems to be taking place in Washington's relations with Beijing, and it threatens to produce a similar ugly outcome in East Asia over the Taiwan issue. End quote. Daniel Larison is a journalist and foreign policy analyst, PhD graduate from the University of Chicago. He says that rhetoric is not enough on this point. Backing down from the brink requires action. Quote, it is not enough simply to say that the U.S. doesn't see conflict or a new Cold War. The U.S. has to back up those statements by exercising restraint in what it does and how it talks about the relationship with China. To prevent tensions over Taiwan from getting worse, Washington needs to worry less about building up its military strength in the region and instead focus on reassuring the Chinese government that it does not want to abandon the status quo that has kept the peace for more than 40 years. End quote. The U.S. needs to change course quickly to avoid charging off the brink and pulling the whole world with it. And affirming the resolution will do just that. The U.S. needs to pull back U.S. support, and this goes doubly true given that Taiwan, while important, is not nearly important enough to justify the U.S.'s continued military support and the attendant risk. Emma Ashford is a senior fellow with the Stimson Center. Matthew Croning is vice president and senior director of the Atlantic Council. Quote, Taiwan's strategic significance to the United States is not even remotely enough to risk a war with China. There are countries in Asia, Japan and South Korea, for example, that are important enough for the United States to commit to defend, but in the case of Taiwan, the imbalance of interests and capabilities is just too high. It's going to be extremely difficult for the U.S. government to fight a war that isn't particularly popular or strategically important against a state where it is popular and important. War over Taiwan might cause the international system to collapse. There's plenty of evidence that the U.S. might well lose such a war, costing the lives of many Americans and potentially demoting the U.S. to a second-tier power, end quote. What do we have to win? A temporary delay of the inevitable, protecting a small island far away from a change of government for the time being. What do we have to lose? A great many lives, countless billions of dollars, a collapse of the international system, and U.S. hegemony itself. And that's if the war can be contained to Taiwan and to conventional weapons, both of which are open questions. Even if it was strategically important enough to justify war, support isn't sustainable. Military support fails to address any underlying issues, and each day it continues to risk fatal miscalculation or stumbling into a war. Eric Gomez is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. We'll hear from him a number of times this lecture. Quote, the biggest weakness of sustaining a military U.S. minimum military advantage is that it does not resolve any of the underlying issues in the cross-strait dispute, most important of which is the fact that Taiwan matters more to China than it does to the United States, end quote. Okay, back to the US-China relationship. Why does it matter that the US and China aren't friendly? Why can't the US support its point of view, a democratic and independent Taiwan, and China its own? The fact is, US-China cooperation is imperative to address the challenges humanity currently faces. Quote, as the US intensifies its efforts to support Taiwan, it risks further damaging the relationship with China and hamstringing its ability to advance US interest on a wide range of other issues, from arms control to climate change. That is Larison 23. So although this may be the only contention, this internal link can allow you to branch out into arguments about any crucial area of US-China cooperation. Next, continued US military support to Taiwan represents continued cost to the US. The first is risk. Gomez 16 notes this discontinuity between cost and benefit. Quote, the US defense relationship with Taiwan is a risky and costly commitment that has become increasingly difficult to sustain. The US commitment to Taiwan is simultaneously the most perilous and least strategically necessary commitment that the United States has today, end quote. And this risk is not static. It continues to grow every day. He says, quote, American credibility is slowly eroding as China becomes more powerful, and the commitment will be more costly to maintain for relatively minor benefit, end quote. Next, inventory. Sending weapons to Taiwan also represents the opportunity cost of not sending weapons to other countries, or to stockpiling them for American defense, including contingencies the US is unprepared for in conflicts with China, including a conflict over Taiwan. If we do aim to defend Taiwan, maintaining an adequate arsenal gives us more strategic options in defending ourselves and our allies. Wilson Beaver is the policy advisor for defense budgeting and the Heritage Foundation's Allison Center for National Security. Quote, the Pentagon's munitions planning problems are not just in the past. They will shape the way that America can fight the next war. For example, war games have indicated that the Pentagon only has enough crucial munitions to fight China if it launches an invasion of Taiwan for about a week. That is clearly not enough munitions to engage in a prolonged conflict with China, not to mention maintaining the capability necessary for deterrence, or if necessary to go to war in other theaters, like Europe or Korea. A fight over Taiwan would primarily require high-end anti-ship weapons, ship defense missiles, and ground attack munitions to destroy anti-access area denial systems. The US does not currently have an adequate supply of any of these munitions, end quote. Now you'll notice that money is not on our list of costs to the US, and that is because, unlike Israel and Ukraine, Taiwan pays for its own defense, and military support primarily entails selling Taiwan the arms it wants and needs. Okay, finally, war impacts. If the US and China go to war, it could get real bad real fast. Here are some of the likely impacts. You'll notice we don't have a US draw-in link, and that's because I couldn't find a good one. The truth is we don't know what the president would decide, or even who the president would be, or when the invasion will be. But even with a probability below 100%, we can score some impacts and maintain that reducing military support for Taiwan is still a net good. So first, the economy. What happens when you cut off the world's first largest economy from the world's second largest? When the latter manufactures 30% of the world's stuff? When trillions in assets are frozen? When global shipping is disrupted? When deeply entwined global supply chains are eviscerated overnight? I'll let the sources describe it. Each of these in turn, listed here. It would fragment the global economy. The global economy would be devastated, making collateral damage out of people everywhere. A Chinese blockade or war over Taiwan could do as much as $10 trillion in damage to the global economy. An invasion of Taiwan would represent one of the most horrific business disruptions the world has ever seen. And the list goes on and on. On the plus side, thrifting and yard sales would get a lot more lucrative because we wouldn't be able to make anything anymore. No more new stuff. Next, China, the US, and Taiwan all engage in activities that permanently suspend us on the brink of nuclear war. Sulman Khan is a professor of international history and Chinese foreign relations at Tufts University. Quote, the new normal meant more ships and planes operating in close proximity to one another, mutual recrimination and mutual suspicion. Beijing and Washington have become desensitized to the risk these circumstances pose. But in the militarization of foreign policy and the failure to grasp the full significance of that militarization, the pair are one accident and a bad decision removed from a catastrophic war. Mathematicians speak of the edge of chaos, the final point separating order from doom. A system operating at this edge has no room for error. This is what the accumulated weight of the past has brought the United States, China, and Taiwan. They walked right up to the edge of the war that could go nuclear several times in the past. Now, they seem to be living on that edge permanently. End quote. Deteriorating Sino-American relations increase the chance of war and decreases the chance of dialogue and diplomacy being able to stop a war. This is demonstrated in China's recent decision to end non-proliferation talks as a direct result of continued arms sales to Taiwan. Last, it is hard to see how a war between the US and China over Taiwan would end, especially if China failed to achieve the fait accompli that I described before. Once wars start, as we see in Ukraine or Gaza, or the most absurd and most disturbing case of World War I, they take on a life of their own, one that no logic or reason can bring to an end. If you aren't fairly educated on World War I recommend Dan Carlton's, is that what his name is? His series on World War I. It's called Ghosts of the Ostfront, I believe. It's like 20 hours long or something. I highly recommend it. Link it below. Not Ostfront. I'll link it below. Howard French is a professor at Columbia. Quote, many analysts also believe that for a war like this to end, one side would have to emerge so markedly superior in residual strength that the other would effectively capitulate and accept inferiority in the global pecking order. But the difficulty of imagining either one of them reconciling itself to such an outcome means that ending the conflict could be as hard as fighting it. End quote. Final point on war. Neg will argue that arms actually prevent war by deterring China. This is simply untrue. China's military is leagues above Taiwan's, and the gap is quickly growing. The question is not whether China can and will invade Taiwan. The question is whether the US will be caught up in the spurring of a global catastrophe as a result. Affirming the resolution gives the answer that no, the US should not let the status quo lead us to calamity. This war will happen, unless it can happen peacefully. The US can be part of that, or it can be part of something much, much worse, something that the AF does not want. Okay, the second contention, kind of, is self-defense. This argument is that ending military support would force Taiwan to confront its deep-seated military issues and find creative solutions for self-defense, thus de-risking the situation in regards to US-China war while effectively maintaining Taiwan's status quo by other means. First, military issues. As we've seen in the background section, Taiwan has immense issues with its military. It spends a paltry sum on its self-defense, still invests in expensive legacy systems, and wastes valuable training resources on ineffective skills, like those pictured. But worst of all, it hardly seems to be trying to change. Even planned reforms are scheduled for years out when these reforms need to be tackled instead with a furious urgency. Holmes Liao, previously served as a distinguished adjunct lecturer at Taiwan's War College. It's always crazy in these lectures, and maybe it's just an obvious thing from not having gone through these so many times, but like the degree with which my pronunciation of words and tripping up degrades as I go through the lecture. It just gets silly by the end of it. I'm trying my best here. All right, Holmes Liao, quote, Taiwan remains recalcitrant to conduct a much-needed military reform to transform into a modern fighting force. Three intangible yet ubiquitous problems must be tackled: unprofessionalism, defeatism, and Chinese nationalism for outside assistance to be effective. The ministry desperately needs to update its policies and training curriculums. Defense ministers under President Tsai Ing-wen have advocated the return of bayonet charge training. The ministry incomprehensibly plans to require soldiers to practice goose steps. In an environment where everyone does pointless routines, soldiers eventually become nonchalant, develop predisposed defeatism. Without a scrupulous transformation from the top, Taiwan's military will continue to prepare to fight the last war they lost to the Chinese communists more than 70 years ago. Time may not be on Taiwan's side for the complicated, long-term endeavor. The challenges are formidable, and the solution will be tantamount to shock therapy for the fundamental transformation." End quote. Okay, so they got big problems, and that is what we should be fixing. Affirming the resolution may be exactly the shock therapy that Taiwan needs to finally take its own defense theory seriously. Quote, "Increasing American support for Taiwan without any preconditions regarding Taiwan's role in its own defense would be detrimental in the long run. Taiwan and the United States, other East Asian allies, are willing to cheap ride on American security guarantees. Taiwan is not disinterested in self-defense, but if someone else is shouldering the burden, there's less urgency to do more, especially if increasing military spending means reducing social spending." End quote. That is Gomez 16. Indeed, there are many innovations that Taiwan could invest in to cheaply defend itself, if only it had the impetus to do so. These include sea mines, building artificial reefs out of concrete, or more investment in drones. We have cards for all of those. Now, before ending this section, I should mention one other line of argumentation if you're looking for something a tad more unique, that China taking Taiwan would be a good thing, and therefore that we should tacitly allow it by reducing military support. You might argue that Chinese hegemony is better than American hegemony, for example, by emphasizing pragmatism and peace over idealism and war, relationships, Confucian values. You could argue that authoritarianism is a more effective method of control than democracy, which is really needed for the global problems these days. We need more centralized control, not less. Or that a multipolar world is better than the US-led unipolar world. I don't endorse any of these ideas per se, but I have certainly heard wilder things in debate rounds. Now, let's dispense with this nonsense of the affirmative team and negate. As with the last section, I have one main argument, and in this one, one little tiny argument at the end. All right. The US should maintain the status quo to uphold the hegemony that has brought peace, stability, and growth to the world for more than 70 years. Letting Taiwan fall by pulling back on support would break our alliance structure and free China to dominate global politics. The result would be a steady or a sudden degradation of our values, including our ability to protect stability, economic growth, and human rights around the globe. Negating is the most righteous choice for the US, for Taiwan, and for the world. We start with US hegemony. This is so long. US hegemony, the global Pax Americana, has led to a 70-year global security and stability, where liberal democracy has proliferated, trade has flourished, extreme poverty and hunger have dropped to single-digit numbers, and where US-led institutions like the UN have facilitated international cooperation and protected global commons. However, as China tries to expand, this state of affairs is at risk. In the status quo, China is hemmed in by the first island chain, including the US allies Japan, Korea, and the Philippines. This prevents the forward naval projection that would be required to control shipping lanes and to harass and control other nations. Taiwan is the jewel in the chain, and with it, China would be unleashed. Its hegemonic ambitions that started with Tibet, then Xinjiang and Hong Kong, expanded into the oceans and beyond. Elbridge Colby is an American national security policy professional who served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development under Trump. He illustrates the consequences of allowing China's ambition to unfold, what it would mean for the American way of life, and how negating the resolution is vital to defending America's interests. Quote, "So how could China pose such a threat to our interests? By dominating Asia, Asia is now again the center of the world, upward of 50% of global GDP going forward. If Beijing could dominate Asia, it would be in a very strong position to dominate the world and us. If China becomes dominant in such a way over Asia, it will have a controlling influence over roughly half of the global economy. With this power, it will undoubtedly ensure that it is the center, the prime beneficiary, and effectively the director of the global economy. Americans might be physically secure, given our 2 oceans and our nuclear arsenal, but we would be much less prosperous and economically secure, and thus also much less free. We'd be compelled to dance to Beijing's tune. Taiwan is important to Americans for 2 reasons, because it is militarily crucial and because it is a bellwether. Taiwan is vital to the defense of Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. If China occupied Taiwan, it would pose a much greater threat to these countries and be able to project power deep into the Pacific, a very real possibility, as we can see from China's activities in Solomon Islands and its construction of an enormous ocean-going navy, including aircraft carriers. Taiwan is the canary in the coal mine. This is what denial defense does. It focuses on defeating a Chinese invasion of an ally, ensuring Beijing cannot seize and hold their key territory. This is actually a relatively low strategic standard, just denial of an invasion, not conquest, dismembering China, or changing its regime. This strategy is rooted in a practical, hard-nosed assessment of what is in America's concrete economic and political interests. It's not about ending evil in the world. It is about defending Americans' security, liberties, and prosperity from a very real, and in terms of China's gigantic scale, unprecedented danger. End quote. Again, that's Colby 22. Now, you might argue that China's ambitions are non-unique to Taiwan, that its tendrils can spread elsewhere to erode American interests. But Taiwan, with its unique political and geostrategic position in the first island chain, is vital to reining in China's grand ambitions and to preserving the current world order. Hope O'Dell is a reporter for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. She confirms uniqueness. Quote, Taiwan is among a string of islands, including Japan and the Philippines, that are allied with the U.S. This makes Taiwan essential to ensuring the security of the region and U.S. interests, like capping China's power and maintaining its asymmetric advantage over China. End quote. David Sachs is a fellow for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He talks about some impacts of the chain breaking. Quote, while the U.S. is thousands of miles from Taiwan, the island's fate will have major implications for U.S. security and prosperity. What happens in the Taiwan Strait will also bear on fundamental questions of international order and the future of democracy. With Taiwan under China's control, it would be far more difficult for the U.S. to maintain a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific or prevent a Chinese bid for regional dominance. The stakes are clear, which is why the U.S. needs to redouble its efforts to deter China from using force or coercion to achieve unification with Taiwan. End quote. Trey Walker is a Republican political advisor in the state of South Carolina. He echoes Sachs' sentiment that when Taiwan falls, China is unlikely to stop. End quote, end quote, begin quote. Additional strategic considerations arise with issues of trade and territorial disputes. A Chinese military and commercial position on Taiwan would open a gateway to the Pacific that could be used for military or trade purposes, such as expanding control over the South China Sea or dominating Pacific markets. With these expansions would come a rise in Chinese regional power at the expense of the United States. Thus, it is in the best interest of the United States to ensure that Taiwan remains a military ally of the U.S. and stays out of Chinese hands. End quote. U.S. hegemony and its ability to enforce global stability and security depends on its strong alliance of partners. Letting Taiwan fall to China would be a firm signal to its allies that the U.S. cannot be trusted to come to their aid. Dr. Satoru Nagao is a fellow at the Hudson Institute. Quote, if America abandoned Taiwan, U.S. allies and partners would be skeptical of the U.S. commitment to their security. This would affect the alliance system not only in Northeast Asia, but also throughout the whole world. End quote. The result would be a cataclysmic shift in the global order, including proliferation, alliances switching to China, and empowering authoritarian revisionism. Here's Masters and Morrow, 24. These, by the way, are why we're at an hour and 40 minutes. Quote, the fall of Taiwan to Chinese forces could lead to a serious erosion of U.S. power in the region, including a weakening of its alliances. If the U.S. does not defend Taiwan, U.S. allies could come to question their reliance on Washington and either pursue strategic autonomy, potentially including nuclear weapons, or bandwagon with China. If China used force to try to annex Taiwan, coming on the heels of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it would be another example of an authoritarian power attempting to unilaterally redraw borders. If China were to succeed, it could significantly undermine a pillar of international order. End quote. Ian Baruma is a professor of human rights. He echoes Masters and Morrow's concerns about capitulation and proliferation. Quote, an attack on Taiwan would also be an attack on Japan and South Korea. If allowed to dominate the South and East China Seas, China would have a stranglehold over the economies of both countries. If Japan and South Korea lose confidence in America's ability or commitment to defend their security, they would either have to submit to Chinese domination or start acquiring nuclear weapons, and fast. End quote. A side note on proliferation, the Bandao 223 card makes a very good case for giving Taiwan nukes. I'm not talking about a lot of the counter-plan-like cards in this lecture because I want to stay focused. Obviously, you can see how focused we are. But a case can actually be made that proliferation to our allies, including Taiwan, isn't such a bad thing on balance. Okay, Prioritize Taiwan. Alliance prioritization arguments might apply to more countries than Taiwan. A non-country without formal diplomatic relations and without a formal security alliance, why should the US prioritize limited arms to Taiwan compared to other allies and other conflicts around the world? First, Ukraine. In Ukraine cases, there is no major issues of prioritization. The arms that Ukraine needs are primarily artillery, air defense, and long-distance strike. Taiwan, on the other hand, primarily needs anti-air and anti-naval equipment, and especially portable, concealable systems, not the large artillery that Ukraine is using. Although there is certainly overlap in needs, continuing to arm Ukraine and Taiwan aren't mutually exclusive. Israel, however, does compete with Taiwan, as each requires high-tech equipment. However, if needing to choose, the US government should prioritize arms shipments to Taiwan over shipments to Israel. This is true even given Israel's new war in Lebanon or a future direct conflict with Iran. Jordan Cohen was a policy analyst in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute. Jennifer Kavanaugh was a senior fellow at the American Statecraft Program. They argue that if America is serious about its pivot to Asia, and if China is truly the adversary we say it is, Taiwan and nearby US installations should be prioritized above Israel. And again, they also mention explicitly the Lebanon war and a future war directly with Iran. They say in both cases, prioritize Taiwan. Okay, argument 2 out of 2, if you can call this one an argument, is economy. In the aft section, I presented a number of quotes saying that the US-China war would lead to global economic ruination. For Neg, this still holds true. The difference is that in order to prevent such a war and the economic impacts that follow, we need to continue with status quo arms sales to deter China from invading. Again, Hope O'Dell, this time on Taiwan US investments and the necessity of US support to stave off economic ruin. Quote, in 2020, Taiwan invested almost $137 billion in the US, while the US invested $31.5 billion in Taiwan the same year. Building up Taiwan's arms to stave off any Chinese military action also prevents a costly conflict that will lead to thousands of deaths and risk global financial harm. Part 2, chips. Microchips are crucial for every electronic you can name. The more advanced the electronic, the more likely the chip came from a Taiwanese fab. Continued arms sales, in as far as they deter a Chinese invasion and prevent war, are crucial to prevent a collapse in global technology supply and in technological innovation worldwide. So this is a quote from Center for Preventative Action 23. They talk about the importance of Taiwan and TSMC. And then they say, quote, FBI Director Christopher Wray warned that invasion of Taiwan would represent one of the most horrific business disruptions the world has ever seen, as a political sanctions regime against China would harm the global economy at a much larger scale than the current sanctions response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, end quote. This again is in the context of chips. Another quote from them, if conflict between China and Taiwan were to break out, global supply chains would be severely disrupted to the detriment of US interests. All right, now another thing missing. You may have noticed a major missing piece, that the US military support actually works to deter China. I mean, they haven't invaded yet. Is that because of the military support, or is that something else? Or is that a combination of things? Has that changed? Or would the military support actually stop an invasion? So does it actually provide the deterrence by denial and the deterrence by punishment that it suggests it does? This, dear friends, is for you to find, for I am weary. And where are we at? 56 pages of script writing. Yeah, and almost 2 hours. Seems like a good place to stop. And because this is just inherently difficult to prove. So that concludes the Taiwan lecture. Next month, we will visit Africa for the January 2025 topic. Visit Africa for the first time since the West African urbanization topic 3 years ago. Thank you for watching. Best of luck on this topic. Please leave any questions in the comments. Feel free to email me about anything, including canceling your subscription. Just send me an email, I can do it. But thank you for subscribing. It means the world to me, and again, keeps these lectures free. But most importantly, remember to be kind to yourself and to the people around you. Love you all, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.